Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani on this Friday evening. How are you doing?
Michael, in the words of Donald J. Trump, I'm locked and loaded. I'm ready to go.
When did he say that?
I think it was perhaps prior to the unlawful extrajudicial killing of General Qasem Soleimani.
Interesting. That would make sense. We're going to talk about this evening Venezuela's election. Big story of the week. Maduro says he's won. The opposition say he hasn't. What's the truth? We'll also talk about a row over women's boxing at the Olympics, which I have to say has become somewhat divorced from reality, I think. First, though, more on the far-right riots. This was the moment a police car was set alight amid a riot in Hartlepool on Wednesday. Riots in Hartlepool followed similar scenes in Southport on Tuesday. They've all sought to exploit the tragic killing of 3 young girls on Monday this week. In the unrest in Hartlepool, police were pelted with bottles, eggs, and other missiles. And now an 11-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of arson in relation to the torched vehicle. 7 men have also been charged with violent disorder. 3 were held in custody and appeared in court today. ITV News reported this. Anthony Allen, 42, of Ormsby Road, Hartlepool, appeared at Teesside Magistrates Court, charged with violent disorder and assaulting an emergency worker. James Elliott, 41, of Raby Road, Hartlepool, was with him in the dock, charged with violent disorder. Peter Clark, 47, of No Fixed Address, appearing separately, was charged with violent disorder and exposure after allegedly showing his buttocks and genitalia to police. No pleas were entered to any of the charges. Of course, none of these people have been convicted, but quite easy to say that I feel a bit more sympathy with the 11-year-old than I do with these 3 men in their 40s. Of those men, 2 were denied bail, reportedly prompting a member of the public gallery to shout, "Out of order!" in response to the judge's decision. Their next court appearances are expected to be in September. And more arrests are expected in the coming days, with a senior Cleveland police constable saying this is very much a live investigation, and we are continuing to work to identify those involved in the disorder yesterday evening and bring them to justice. Disorder of this kind will not be tolerated, and those found to be involved will be robustly dealt with. The far-right riots we've seen across parts of England erupted after false claims that the Southport stabbing perpetrator was a Muslim circulated online. Also lots of claims that maybe he was a small boat migrant, none of them true. The riots have impacted Hartlepool's Muslim community, with faith leaders at the Nasir Mosque being told by police to block their gate. General Secretary of the mosque, Mohammed Ali Ahmad, told The Guardian this. Obviously, the Muslim community will be concerned for their own safety, for the safety of their families and of their mosque. You do look over your shoulder at times like these, which isn't reassuring and is troubling. I said to my mother, who's 65, don't go outside for a few days. Let things calm down. Really tragic to read that. A Muslim caller to Carol Vorderman's LBC show gave this powerful response to a text defending the rioters.
I'm proud of every single patriot. I don't know where this word's come from. And if you ensure safety on the streets, Carol, because that's what I want, safety on the streets, this is where James says, stop mass immigration of young Muslim men immediately. What do you say about that, Shamoon?
I just think that's outright racism, and just Islamophobia. And I feel like if he said that about any other faith, or, a faith group out there, it would be completely unacceptable. But, I'm raising 2 young sons who are Muslim in this country. And when I think that, I just think, okay, is this really a good place to be brought up as a Muslim anymore? Are they really valued in society anymore? What difference does it make if they've come from a different country, if they're born here, if people only see, brown skin and perhaps, coming out of a mosque? They're not going to think any different of my children. And that makes me really sad. Other Muslims, or sometimes when I speak to people, they look at me and they think, gosh, you probably can't speak English, or, oh, do you drive? And all these misconceptions about what it means to be brown and Muslim visibly. And I feel, but also having said that, would I engage in that conversation? Probably not, because a lot of my friends who do look like me have experienced rough, violent Islamophobic hate crimes, the headscarves being pulled off, people being barged past on purpose, in the supermarket or on the tube. And I fear for my life as it happens. And the Southport violence makes it seem like, people say, oh, that's an exaggeration, but is it?
No, really, really difficult to listen to that, really. A young Muslim woman, Muslim mother, sort of saying she fears for her life. I have to say, she's actually saying that she's also got lots of friends who've experienced sort of situations like that. I think it's fairly clear that the people on these far-right demonstrations haven't been representative of the majority of the country, but obviously you don't need many people to sort of motivate and inspire fear in a much larger proportion of the population, which seems to be what's going on at the moment. It is, in many cases, legitimized by the far-right media, which we're actually going to talk about a bit more towards the end of tonight's show. Looking forward, according to the BBC, far-right activists around the country are planning at least 30 demonstrations over the weekend. Chief Constable Andy Marsh met with Keir Starmer today to discuss the threat posed by those demonstrations. He told the BBC this.
What I committed to the Prime Minister to do today was to write to all those commanders to be very explicit about new guidance and rapid learning from these events about how we separate what might be legitimate protest from what is, frankly, downright violent crime. And so that we can intervene more quickly, we can arrest offenders, we can act to deter, and we can work with the criminal justice system to bring those people to very swift justice if people break the law.
Aaron, when we were discussing, it wasn't you on the show, but when I was discussing on Wednesday's show, I think, sort of the aftermath of the Southport riot, one of the things, sort of my instant reactions was, these people look so appalling and so terrible, sort of trying to exploit a tragic death of children to kind of get pissed and throw rocks at the police, that no one is going to want to join this movement. And I still sort of stay with my assumption that I don't think they're persuading many people across the country. But it wasn't an isolated incident, and it does seem as if sort of this movement is, keen to show its face a little bit more over the next few days.
I think that's true. I think ultimately lots of the 4 million plus people that voted Reform, for instance, in the last general election, instinctively these people want law and order. They're critical of the police because they don't maintain law and order harshly enough, according to them. They certainly don't back violent disorder, even if they might agree on certain issues relating to migration and the kinds of people living in the UK, including people like myself. My father is Iranian. So that's one part of it. But also, I would say, Michael, if this was a movement which was based upon protest repertoires and tactics of, say, civil rights, if you saw people like Tommy Robinson et al., blocking streets and waiting for the police to assault them and being recipients of police violence, for instance, were that to happen, they'd have a much stronger moral case to the rest of the country. And they'd say, look, we have a real dysfunction here in terms of how policing works, which is a historic tactic of dissident movements from the 1960s, for instance, trying to expose the brutality of the state and the partiality with which it uses violence. So I think that's right. The response from these groups, many of them obviously on the far right, doesn't really help their quote-unquote cause. What we saw in Hartlepool was people looking for a little bit of a scrap, somebody who's a little bit dark, a little bit of a punch. They want to scrap. And of course, they want to scrap with somebody who can't fight back. Classic. Of course, that's how bullies work. So that's not new, by the way. That's not new. This is something we've seen in this country for a very long time. Of course, it was far more profound. It was, explicitly called that in the 70s, the 80s, to a lesser extent, the 1990s. And that's what this movement seemingly wants. So it's very legible to the rest of the country. And I find it hard to believe it will scale. And I think ultimately that speaks to how stupid these people are, because you've had 3 young girls killed brutally, disgustingly. The person who's guilty of this, I think, frankly, should never see the light of day ever again. Again, I'm sure some people might disagree with that. I'm not interested in rehabilitating somebody who's killed 3 small children. But at the same time, I just don't think any sensible person says, well, you know what the response to that is? Go and beat up some random brown person, And I think that does also apply, particularly, like I say, to those 4 million plus people who voted Reform, who might put themselves on the same political side as various influencers endorsing or backing these actions. So I think it's very unwise from a sort of political perspective. But look, my view on people like Tommy Robinson or Lawrence Fox is that they're so stupid. I sometimes think they're MI6, MI5 rather, honeypots, because everything they touch turns to shit. I mean, Tommy Robinson's addicted to getting arrested, it seems to me. And Lawrence Fox has clearly never been part of a successful political movement in his life. He never will be. So these scenes being mediated through social media, obviously very powerful. And of course, they will include local people who are simply disgusted. But I think that quote unquote Paki bashing, which is what this is fundamentally, will even put those people off if it carries on.
It's now 5 days since Venezuela's electoral authority declared that Nicolas Maduro had won re-election as the country's president. But the country's opposition has not accepted defeat. This is part of a report from Channel 4 News.
If toppled statues of his mentor, the late Hugo Chavez, is how you measured political demise in Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro would be worried. It's not, though. Not yet. Yesterday, crowds came out onto the streets in cities and towns across Venezuela, echoing calls by the opposition and many in the international community that the weekend's election results were not transparent. What was striking, the thousands who came into the capital, Caracas, on motorbikes from the surrounding slums, objecting to another 6 years of Maduro's brand of socialism.
We're tired of Maduro, tired of being whipped. The Bastani neighbourhood is here, Maduro. We came for you.
Protests after disputed election results are nothing new in Venezuela. Neva is chiming in from Washington, and last night the United States recognized Maduro's rival, Edmundo Gonzalez, as the winner of last Sunday's election. There is something new this time around, though, and that's that even regional leaders on the left, so who are usually sort of friendly with Maduro, are refusing to recognize this election result as legitimate. And that includes the leaders of the three biggest countries in Latin America, President Lula of Brazil, President Lopez Obrador of Mexico, and President Petro of Colombia, who have all called on Venezuela's electoral authorities to release the full tally of votes across the country before they will make any determination as to who has actually won. And that complaint about releasing the details of voting tallies is one which has been echoed by the Carter Center for Democracy. That's one of the few established international groups that were able to observe the election last weekend. And they released this statement on Wednesday. Venezuela's 2024 presidential election did not meet international standards of electoral integrity and cannot be considered democratic. The Carter Center cannot verify or corroborate the results of the election declared by the National Election Council, the CNE, and the electoral authority's failure to announce disaggregated results by polling station constitutes a serious breach of electoral principle. Venezuela's electoral process did not meet international standards of electoral integrity at any of its stages and violated numerous provisions of its national laws. The election took place in an environment of restricted freedoms for political actors, civil society organizations, and the media. Throughout the electoral process, the CNE demonstrated a clear bias in favor of the incumbent. Now, the Carter Center is one of the sort of international organizations that previously Maduro and Chavez before him have sort of said is actually sort of the international observer that we trust. That's why it was allowed to remain in Venezuela when others weren't, and they have said this was not a fair election. To discuss the situation in Venezuela, I spoke earlier today to Alejandro Velasco, a professor in Latin American history at NYU.
On Sunday, we had the elections, and what has happened in many previous elections in Venezuela, including those that have been very fraud and highly contested, is that the Electoral Council has reported the vote-by-vote, machine-by-machine tallies pretty soon after the initial announcement of who the winner is. We didn't receive that on Sunday. The first report from the National Electoral Council, which was right after midnight on Sunday, a little bit late because of claims of hacking that have not been substantiated by the government. But they announced that with 80% of the tallies, Nicolas Maduro had won. But again, they did not release the machine-by-machine votes or the reports. And so that's been one lingering question, because as the days go on, rather than releasing the returns, which is what an increasing number both of local observers and international observers have been calling for, the government has not done so, and the National Electoral Council has been quite quiet. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, who really stands in for the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, they did post online upwards of 73% of copies of the machine-by-machine tallies on a website that they had created. Now, there's been some questions as to the veracity of those, of that as proof, but it does weigh into what's been this post-electoral landscape of questioning whether, in fact, the results that were announced by the National Electoral Council on Sunday are, in fact, what happened at the ballot boxes.
You've said this is sort of unusual that the electoral authorities haven't published these sort of tallies on sort of district by district voting. Have they come up with an excuse as to why that's the case? Sort of, what's the government narrative as to why these haven't yet been published?
It's curious, and in some ways part of the reason why there is so much uncertainty and skepticism swirling, because actually the narratives have been quite muted, certainly by the Electoral Council, which has essentially said nothing. Not only is the National Electoral Council's website down, and it has been for days now, so inaccessible, but also the offices themselves are closed. Now, in part, they have said that they closed them on Monday and then on Tuesday because of protests, some of them quite violent, that have been unleashed in Caracas and in many other cities around Venezuela after the protests. But even now, when they have been abating those protests, the electoral authority offices remain closed. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, the government has said, well, the delay in the report of the initial report was due to what it called a brutal hacking campaign from parties unknown, although Maduro recently came out and said that Elon Musk is likely behind some of the electronic warfare efforts. And then more recently, they have said that as a result of this hacking, they've been unable to post all the returns and been unable to regain control over their website. So those have been the primary areas that the government has used to claim that they can't really post the returns.
How significant is sort of international recognition here? Because I suppose there are sort of some familiar scenes from Venezuela if we look at sort of recent elections, which is you've got a government that claims they've won, an opposition which says, no, this was completely unfair. Then you've got the United States, who obviously sides with the opposition. And then you've got China and Russia, et cetera, who side with Venezuela. So far, so familiar. What seems different this time around is leaders such as Lula, from Brazil, Gustavo Petro from Colombia, AMLO from Mexico. These are sort of big left-wing presidents in the region who seem to be keeping their powder dry. They're sort of saying, we're not going to sort of say either way who we think has won. We just want these tallies to be printed. How different is that to sort of previous elections in Venezuela?
Massively. In fact, in some ways, it's making all the difference right now. And I'll explain that in a second. We have not had a circumstance in certainly the last 10 years that Maduro has been in office, but even before, when Hugo Chavez was president and elections were being held and sometimes contested, when there has been ideological alignment across the ideological spectrum, or political alignment across the ideological spectrum on a very simple demand, which is that the government and the National Electoral Authority release the data at the precinct by precinct, machine by machine level. That has not happened. That is quite unusual. In the past, what you've had is governments that are either like-minded, coming out very strongly and very quickly in support of the electoral results, or if there have been some skepticisms, nevertheless raising those skepticisms, but convalidating the results. Or what's been more common is governments that are unfriendly to the Venezuelan government, issuing condemnations or refusing to recognize the electoral results. So we've not seen this kind of cross-ideological alignment in the region, which is really quite significant because at least up until yesterday night, when U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken came out with a report essentially saying, or a statement saying that they are likely to recognize Gonzalez as the winner of the election, it really was, I think, the local regional voices that were taking the lead, and wisely so, on trying to stem the rise of tensions in Venezuela. To the extent that that can continue, we might be able to see some kind of forward progress in terms of negotiated transition. To the extent that the U.S. become more and more vocal in leading efforts to steer one outcome or another, you might see some of that, again, cross-ideological unity break apart.
Could I get you to talk about the sort of broader political, social, economic context in Venezuela at the moment? I mean, our audience will be sort of aware of Chavez and Maduro with the Bolivarian Revolution, which sort of had these intentions to distribute wealth in the country. It seems as if in the last few years, the situation in Venezuela has become quite catastrophic, with sort of the economy seeming to become somewhat defunct. You've had millions of people leave the country. Could you talk about sort of where Venezuela stands at the moment?
Venezuela went from very promising project of social redistribution of wealth under the presidency of Hugo Chavez, in part, and in fact, significant part, aided by the fact that at the time, oil prices were high, and Venezuela relies almost exclusively in terms of its revenues from oil prices. But they hadn't really been distributed broadly and socially as had been at the scale that Hugo Chavez did so while he was president. When Maduro came into office, number one, oil prices began to decline. Number two, the accumulated debts of massive amounts of social spending under Chavez really came to a head. But number three, you began to have a different geopolitical landscape in the region, where increasingly more right or center-right governments in Latin America, but then, of course, eventually the Trump administration in the United States came to power and really began to exercise what they call the maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela, with the explicit intent of ousting the Chavista government. And so that implied extremely severe sanctions, especially on the country's oil economy, which then further constrained the ability of Venezuela to raise revenue in order to fend not only for its social programs, but also just from day to day. Contributing to that was extreme corruption and mismanagement of fiscal policy, which led to massive hyperinflation. And then, of course, that ushered in this tremendous exodus of Venezuelans, upwards of 7.5 million over the last 10 years. And so, that has in some ways abated over the last 2 to 3 years, but not so much because of any circumstance or policy circumstance, but rather because the government decided to dollarize the economy. Now, dollarization, as we've seen in other contexts, disproportionately negatively affects popular sectors, because if you don't have people who are sending remittances in dollars, or if you don't have access to the dollarized economy, then in a context where there's very little in terms of social services being provided, you really are in a very precarious situation. So that, I think, in part also explains why not only in the context of these elections, have we seen, very predictable protests on part of middle-class sectors who traditionally align with the opposition, but also popular sectors that traditionally did not align with the opposition. They too have been out in the streets. So, that kind of larger social and economic landscape really helps to paint a larger picture about, what's happening in Venezuela today.
Could you talk about the opposition? Who are they? So say, we'll talk in a moment sort of about the role of the army and what a transition could look like. But if there were, say, a peaceful transition from Maduro to the opposition, who now the United States are saying won the election, I don't know, we'll await to see what the sort of the swing players, say Lula, etc. Who are they? What kind of politics do they represent? What kind of sort of economic and social policies would they bring to Venezuela?
It's important to disaggregate, I guess, who's at the top of the ticket, so to speak, with the opposition leadership more broadly. So Edmundo Gonzalez is the person who is whose name is actually on the ballot, and it's there because the primary election winner when the opposition held primaries last year, Maria Corina Machado, who is a long-standing figure in the opposition going back to the early 2000s. In the coup against Chavez in 2002, she spearheaded the recall referendum against Chavez in 2004. She's variously held positions in the opposition leadership, including being elected to Congress or to the National Assembly. So she's a well-known figure, but she had been barred from running for office on claims that she had committed grave crimes against the nation. And so she really appointed Gonzalez as a kind of stand-in or figurehead, but everybody knows that Maria Corina really is the leader of the opposition. And she's done a remarkable job as the opposition stands to unify what is a notoriously fractious opposition, not only in terms of personal interest, but also ideological in terms of its spectrum. So you have people within the opposition that are much more left wing and support the continuation of social programs, and you have some in the opposition, including Maria Corina Machado, who's talked about for instance privatizing not only the healthcare system but also the education system, privatizing the oil industry. And so, if you take them at their word in terms of what they have said as potential policy agendas, it looked very much like what anyone would call a neoliberal economic agenda. But they're not running on that, right? What they're running on is just a transition to something different that is not the Maduro government. And so it really is up in the air in an eventual potential, as you suggested, peaceful transition, what kind of policies would come into place, in part because, of course, it's not just about Maduro, who's in the executive office, but it's also the fact that Chavismo controls the legislature, controls all of the institutions, including the army, who, has the weight of the state behind it. And so, whoever took over, whether it's Gonzalez or Maria Corina or whomever in the opposition, it's not like they could just easily roll their planning into place. They would have to do so with significant opposition from the remaining Chavista state.
In terms of whether or not there will be a transition, what should people be looking out for? I imagine, I suppose we've talked about the key regional players who will presumably be very, very significant. You've just mentioned the army. What will determine how this sort of develops? Is it whether sort of the army side with Maduro or the opposition? Is it sort of how big and consistent the protests in the street are? What should we be looking out for?
I would say that trifecta really is what people should be looking out for. On the one hand, the geopolitical landscape. Will the region remain unified in its pressure upon the Maduro government to release the data and have that data be independently verified? To the extent that the region can remain united, that will be, as we talked about before, a very unusual circumstance in terms of Venezuelan politics. We've not really seen that ever, at least in the last 25 years. The second factor, as you mentioned, is indeed the protests on the street, or at least a level of mobilization. Maria Corina Machado has called for massive demonstrations tomorrow and Saturday. And to the extent that those show a significant level of popular support, that could certainly play a role in continuing to exert pressure in the streets for the government to do one of two things: either to respond to that international pressure and to if it can't actually show that it won, then at least begin the process of negotiating a transition. Or the other option, which of course then leads to the third factor that we should pay attention to, is whether we'll choose to repress. Now, we've seen some evidence of repression already over the past few days. We've had reports of upwards of 15 deaths as a result of the protests that have taken place. But certainly, in previous moments of significant social tension, we've seen far more casualties and fatalities. And of course, if the level of protest in the streets is significant enough, Maduro may feel like they have to call on the army to remain in power. And that, therefore, is the third factor. What will the army do? So far, the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, has pledged his allegiance to Maduro. Of course, the army has a lot invested in the continuation of a Chavista administration. They have financial dealings. They have significant weight in terms of their position vis-a-vis the state. So they too would be needing, some guarantees in an eventual transition. So, my sense now is that there's probably, 24/7 backroom negotiations happening to try to figure out whether or not the people who are in charge of decision making, not the full ones who the United States would want, but the people who actually have control of the state in Venezuela, feel like they could reasonably step down. So those three factors, I think, are the most significant that we should be paying attention to.
A 46-second fight has become the most controversial moment of the Paris Olympic Games. The fight pitted the Algerian boxer Imane Khelif against the Italian Angela Carini. But it came to an abrupt end after Angela Carini abandoned the fight after receiving a punch from Khelif. Carini described the punch as the hardest she'd ever been hit in her career as a boxer. Khelif was declared the winner and won a place in the women's welterweight quarter-finals. So why was that short fight so controversial? Well, it's because Imane Khelif is one of two women boxers at the Olympics who had been suspended from last year's Women's World Championships. That was for failing gender eligibility tests. The president of the International Boxing Association, Umar Kremlev, said that DNA tests had proven that Khelif and another boxer, Lin Yu-ting of Taiwan, had XY chromosomes. Now, XY chromosomes, that's the combination of chromosomes in males. XX is the combination in females. What has complicated this issue, though, is that due to perceived mismanagement, the International Boxing Association is currently not recognized by the International Olympic Committee, and the IOC has said both boxers have complied with all of their rules to compete in the Olympic women's competitions. So you've got two different organizations with different opinions on this matter. So far it's all so complex. However, an undeniably nuanced issue has been jumped upon by people who have fit the controversy into their pre-existing agendas. Whoa, what a surprise that this has happened. J.K. Rowling tweeted this to her 14 million followers. Could any picture sum up our new men's rights movement better? The smirk of a male who knows he's protected by a misogynist sporting establishment, enjoying the distress of a woman he's just punched in the head and whose life's ambition he just shattered. Elon Musk also got involved. So he quote tweets an account called Riley Gaines. They've said men don't belong in women's sports. And Elon Musk says, absolutely. Donald Trump has posted this on his platform, Truth Social. I will keep men out of women's sports. And you can see there's a clip of the boxing match. Now, you might have noticed a common thread among all of these posters is that they are all opposed to trans rights. And most people on social media saw these posts and assumed that Imane Khelif was trans, including, seemingly, former British Prime Minister Liz Truss. So she tweeted this: "When will this madness stop? Men cannot become women. Why is the British government not objecting to this?" However, Imane Khelif did not become a woman. She was born a woman and grew up a woman. This is a childhood photo of Khelif. And she said that initially her father did not allow her to take part in sports because he did not approve of girls boxing. So what's going on here? Well, the combination of the claim from the president of the IBA and the fact of Khelif not being trans means journalists have speculated she might experience a condition called DSD, or difference of sexual development. Now, that's a condition that means, for example, someone born with XY chromosomes might still externally present as a female from birth. Regardless of how the rules regarding inclusion into certain women's sports should or should not be constructed, though, those facts make the international response to Imane Khelif's inclusion in the Olympics appear, at the very least, incredibly unkind. In contrast, I think the best response has come from another woman boxer. So Amy Broadhurst is the 2022 IBA World Light Welterweight Champion, and won the gold medal in the lightweight division at the 2022 Commonwealth Games. She tweeted this on Thursday, so after that fight. I have a lot of people texting me over Imane Khelif. Personally, I don't think she has done anything to cheat. I think it's the way she was born that's out of her control. The fact that she has been beaten by 9 females before says it all. Amy Broadhurst on Instagram sort of posted a slightly sort of longer comment. She said, "This is the last I'm going to speak on this situation because it's a crazy situation. IBA released a statement that 2 boxers failed a gender test over a year ago. That's all well and good. But where are the results? They haven't been published yet. So people are just believing what's been said. Bear in mind, IBA were banned from having anything to do with the Olympics. So what a brilliant time for them to kick up a storm during the Olympic Games. I do not agree with male versus female, as in males fighting females. I never will because it's wrong. But the abuse this person has received in the last 24 hours without any real facts or proof is so wrong. Please keep in mind, if your child was going through something like this, what would you do? Wait for facts, wait for the results to become known, and then you make an opinion, but stop bullying." The intervention of Amy Broadhurst also led to this enormously satisfying exchange. So at the top here, you've got the first tweet I read out to you. Then someone responds, a man called Ben Hyde. "What would your reaction have been if you were supposed to fight Khelif? Amy, I have great respect for your boxing legacy, but you've missed the mark here. Agreed, the way you're born is out of your control, but it's a clear advantage and shouldn't be allowed." And then someone responds to Ben Hyde saying, "Amy Broadhurst did fight Imane Khelif in the 2022 World Championship final, and she won." So that guy got well and truly owned, I think. Aaron, it is a complex topic, this. There's these 2 organizations that have come to different conclusions. It seems like we haven't seen all of the evidence. What does seem clear to me is that a lot of people, without the full facts of the matter, have jumped in and really, fundamentally bullied this woman on a international scale to hundreds of millions of people, so that this person has become, the most controversial issue of the week is the gender identity, or sort of the chromosomes, the testosterone levels of this person. And it does all seem like people are trying to fit this into a pre-existing narrative, which has become, quite horrible, really.
It's an extraordinary story, Michael, because all of a sudden you have people like J.K. Rowling are experts on the IBA and their credibility as a sporting authority. It defies belief. You've got people like Donald Trump, Elon Musk, like I say, J.K. Rowling weighing in. Other figures too. We'll talk about one of those in a moment. To start with, when it comes to this stuff, clearly you shouldn't have people engaged in competitive sports who enjoy an unfair advantage. First things first. At the same time, Khelif, like you say, isn't a trans person. They were born a woman. They were raised a woman. Their father didn't want them to be involved in boxing as a girl. We don't know about their bodily autonomy, their ability to have children. We're in a world now, Michael. It's utterly bizarre, where she could have a uterus and J.K. Rowling's calling them a man. It's just extraordinary. Now, to go back to my initial point about an unfair advantage. Khelif has lost 9 times in 51 fights. Now, like you've said, I don't know all the facts. Clearly, the IBA have an axe to grind with the IOC. We don't know. The truth will out. But it's pretty fair to say that if you've got 9 defeats, you don't have some extraordinary genetic advantage over the rest of the field. You simply don't. We're not talking about somebody who's literally machine gunning all the opposition, Ivan Drago, Rocky IV style. We're talking about somebody who's highly competitive, very good. They've won tournaments, but they lose. And then if you look at their knockout record, 42 wins, 6 by KO. Of course, in amateur boxing, winning by knockout is very unusual. It's very unusual. But at the same time, if you look at Karini's comments, "I've never been hit like this before, I'm giving up after 42 seconds," you would presume there is an extraordinary asymmetry of force, which is simply not common in women's boxing. But if that were the case, there would obviously be far more KOs in that record. Like I say, 42 wins as an amateur boxer, 6 by KO. That doesn't tally with what Karini is saying in terms of her loss. And Karini herself has said, with the gift of time and hindsight, She was upset. She was angry. She should have shaken hands. And that, in fact, she's happy and willing to abide by the decisions of the IOC. That's what Carini said. So you have Carini, who lost, that was the genesis of this whole story, saying they've won by a set of rules I entirely recognize. Carini accepts that, but the author of the Harry Potter book series doesn't accept that. So this really boils down to the IBA and the IOC. Who are you willing to trust? I mean, again, this is just insane, right? Had J.K. Rowling heard of the IBA until this time yesterday? I don't think so. And the IBA, by the way, had their status revoked because of recorded and documented corruption. So it's if you were looking at this from a sort of a legal standpoint, you would say, well, look, they've got previous and they're not particularly good character. If they're going to make these claims, we need to see the documentary evidence, which of course we haven't. Now, you've got the fighter coming up against Khelif now, who's Hungarian. She's shared some pretty horrible things on social media. She's in a bit of a win-win, right? Because of course, if she wins, she can say, I overcame all these extraordinary, unfair asymmetries. And if she loses, she can say, well, this other person shouldn't have been in the ring with me. And I feel really sorry for Khelif because there's no way that she can actually win this battle. Equally, of course, if Khelif does lose, if she loses badly, which may happen, like I say, she's got 9 defeats in her amateur record. If she loses, the whole story is going to look utterly absurd because we've been told by all these influential people, followed by hundreds of millions of individuals online across the world, that this person shouldn't be in a ring. It's absolutely outrageous. It's a physical danger to women. So look, in terms of my personal conclusions on this story, like you've said, we need to see more evidence. We need more time. But it's not impossible that several days from now, a week from now, people are going to look at this story as utterly bewildering and stupid. Because as you've hinted at, the indications aren't that we're dealing with some kind of athlete who has, just an extraordinary advantage over everybody else. They lose quite a lot. I also think, look, there's a lot of sour grapes from Carini and her attitude there, and I think it reflects badly on her. But we'll see. We'll see. Look, we'll see. But right now, I think the vindictiveness and the anger and the hostility from really high-profile people online, given we aren't in receipt of the facts, is really extraordinary. And frankly, Michael, Elon Musk has turned X into a hellhole. I now just see so much, the people engaging with me in quote tweets and replies, we're honestly talking about I think mental illness, frankly. It's in no way congruent with the outside world. You go for a walk, you take the dog for a walk, you talk to people about this stuff, and actually they're quite level-headed, they're quite sensible, they can see both sides of the argument. Twitter, X, has always been a little bit at odds with the real world. Go touch grass, as people always say. But that disparity has never looked broader than it does right now.
And I mean, one thing that's happened today, so obviously yesterday when so many people were tweeting, sort of, if you looked at the row from the outside, it looked like everyone was annoyed because there was a trans person taking part in the boxing. Then, I mean, it's not that it became apparent, it was always obvious. If anyone had actually done any of the research, this wasn't a trans person. Potentially it's someone with an intersex condition, we don't know. But then people sort of roll back and say, I never said she was trans. I never said she was trans. Just that she might have XY chromosomes. Well, then, and then they blame wokeness. They say, I didn't say she was trans, but it was because of wokeness that this would ever have been allowed. And the front page of the Daily Mail today sort of scrawled across it. I saw this when I went to a shop. I'm just getting it up on Twitter now. Watching this gruesome mismatch between a woman and a biological male left me fearing wokery will get someone killed. And what I think is so stupid about this is this idea that this wouldn't have happened in the past. But even if we are to believe the IBA, so the International Boxing Association, and I'm not going to claim I'm an expert on any of these organizations, right? The claim from the International Boxing Association seems to be that this is someone who was identified as a girl when she was born. So it has the external physical characteristics of a woman, but has, if we're to believe the IBA, had a DNA test whereby she has XY chromosomes. So is genetically has the chromosomal characteristics of a man. Now, it's not that modernity or sort of modern discourse has allowed this person to participate. if this person is ultimately excluded, if this woman is ultimately excluded from participating, it's only because we're using very, very modern technology that wasn't available in the past. Because how would you judge if someone was a man or a woman in the past? You'd look at their external features. This person's external features, they are a woman, right? But is the advance of DNA testing, which means that maybe you can sort of judge someone's chromosomal sex to be different to how they present physically. So it seems sort of blaming this on wokeness and saying this could only happen in the modern world. This is only a controversy because we live in an age of DNA testing, if we're to believe the International Boxing Association. Someone who has commented on the controversy surrounding Imane Khelif's inclusion in the women's boxing is Britain's new culture secretary, Lisa Nandy, who said this.
It was a very uncomfortable watch. It was an incredibly short watch, but incredibly uncomfortable to see. And I know from being here in Paris that there are a lot of women competitors who are very concerned, not just about whether we're getting the balance right between inclusion, fairness and safety in boxing, but in other sports as well. Successive governments have always said that these are often quite complex biological matters. In this case, I think it is more complex than is being presented on social media. And so it's right that sporting bodies take those decisions. But I have a role, the government has a role to make sure that they have the guidance, the support and the advice that they need to be able to make those decisions and get that balance right.
So also today, Lisa Nandy spoke to BBC Radio 2, where she made basically exactly the same point she made there. And on that show, she was followed by Steve Bunce. He's a long-time boxing commentator.
What this woman, and I'm going to be really careful here because I've had lots of chats with different people, okay? This is the way it works. Last week, they issued a press release. By the following day, all sorts of ridiculous claims are being made about Imane Khelif, who, by the way, is an Algerian hero. She walks and I use the she properly, she walks 10 kilometres a day to training when she was young because she could not afford the bus fare. She's a UNICEF ambassador. She's been condemned by a test that nobody has seen. It's become established fact. You heard that politician just then talking as though it was fact, and everyone's upset with what they've seen. What did we see? We saw a person who is a fighter in the women's competition beating another fighter in the women's competition. Everything else is pure and utter down to invention, based on a bit of facts. And worst of all, Adrian, and you have to understand this. It's based on how Imane Khelif looks. Sure, there's no way that if any boxer has found a trustworthy gender eligibility test, there's no way that she should be allowed to fight other women. I agree with that, but we have no proof that that's what happened. We're just going completely on zillions of people, including some incredibly powerful figures, damning this girl, this 25-year-old girl from a village in Algeria.
Now, and the contrast was quite striking there, wasn't it, between someone who follows boxing and someone who doesn't. And before everyone, I'm sure if there's someone who's a bit sort of gender critical watching this, they say, well, you've shown a woman be uncomfortable with this and then a man who's comfortable with it. That entirely proves our point that it's men who are comfortable with seeing someone who has, potentially failed a gender test fighting a woman. I would put to that the quotes we showed you a little bit earlier of the female world boxing champion, who very much thinks that everyone should lay off Imane Khelif and thinks she hasn't cheated. Aaron, what do you think about that contrast between sort of the boxing commentator and Lisa Nandy there?
Well, it's somebody who knows what they're talking about and somebody who doesn't. And Nandy is guilty there of that classic shift in contemporary politics, which we've talked about before many times in the show, where politicians now view themselves almost as pundits. It's somebody like your good self, Michael, on, Channel 5, the Jeremy Vine show, commentators or, hosting an LBC call-in rather than being politicians. I mean, Nandy, I think, used something like the formulation, it's my job to XYZ. How is it your job as a government minister for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to comment on speculation pertaining to a fight between an Algerian and an Italian national? Are you now going to go toe-to-toe with the IOC with regards to the rules they've adopted and their relationships with external authorities like the IBA? So it's a classic example, I think, of exposing the pseudo commentariat stylification of our political class, which you see there, but also the fact they really aren't on top of the facts very frequently. So look, it's a bit worrying when, Steve Bunce is obviously going to have more knowledge about this because it's his career, but is going to speak in more politically credible and fluent ways than the relevant government minister. Although I should say, Mike, DCMS is often sort of viewed by ambitious politicians as a bit of a Mickey Mouse department, a stepping stone to something else. After all, it was held by Nadine Dorries. And I suspect that Lisa Nandy can't wait to get out of there. And she was, of course, demoted from a more senior position. So it tends not to elevate the most impressive political figures in the cabinet.
I suppose in Mickey Mouse, in the sense that you don't have that much influence, not that much to do as the Secretary of Culture, Media and Sport, but you do get to attend the Olympics, you get to attend loads of concerts and say, this is all part of my brief. So in a way, maybe it'd be the ideal job. When Keir Starmer spoke to the nation on Thursday about far-right protesters, he was right to use that term, far-right protesters. In Southport and Hartlepool, we saw thugs intimidate worshippers at mosques purely because they are Muslim. In London, we've seen protesters mobilised by far-right leaders like Tommy Robinson, who's recently had to flee the country to escape prosecution for contempt of court. But Britain's right-wing media are furious that Starmer dared to use such a term. This was Mike Graham and Isabel Oakeshott speaking on the Murdoch-owned TalkTV.
Just want to get your view on Keir Starmer's little speech yesterday. I couldn't believe that he had the opportunity to speak to the nation and kind of make out that he understood what the problems were in our nation, and many of which you've highlighted over recent days. But he didn't. All he did was he kind of made it very clear that he's kind of tone deaf about what's going on out there.
I couldn't agree with you more. He fell right into the trap, didn't he? I mean, the words that he said in that statement showed an angry nation that he just doesn't get it. The idea that the eruption of fury that has been witnessed across this country in the last few weeks on all sorts of issues is just some kind of far-right outrage is so utterly misconceived that I've been left wondering how he's got to the level of Prime Minister with such weak political antennae.
I mean, with all due respect, he's come to the position of Prime Minister because he just got voted in by the British electorate, right? Not by an overwhelming proportion of that electorate, but by a big proportion of that electorate, and a much bigger proportion of the electorate than the Brexit Party, which is sort of the director of it. I suppose it's not led anymore. Is Isabel Oakeshott's partner, right? So if we're talking about what the country really thinks, who has more right to suggest that? Isabel Oakeshott or Keir Starmer? I'd say at the moment it's Keir Starmer. Also, the number of people we're seeing on the streets, the idea that this is really representative, the country is furious. The vast majority of the country are looking at these protests organised by the likes of Tommy Robinson, drunk, coked up, throwing bricks at the cops and saying, I want nothing to do with these people. The idea that these are representative of sort of a broader sort of majoritarian or large-scale movement in this country, I think is nonsense. Also on TalkTV, host and former Brexit Party MEP Alex Phillips had this exchange with a former police detective.
A friend just messaged me before and he said, does far right simply mean white? So if any protests occur with white people, does it just simply mean that they're all far right? And straight away they're dismissed. Their views are dismissed without any debate.
I'm glad you said that, Mike, but I actually think there's something else in this. I think far right now means working class.
So according to Alex Phillips, these protesters only get called far right because they're working class. So does she think this scene is representative of working class Britain?
Turn in. Oh! Fucking hell, I caught that. Fucking hell, as if I caught that. Screen recorder.
If you're listening to the podcast, that was a man in Hartlepool punching an Asian man simply for walking towards him and a group of other thugs. And we might also ask if Alex Phillips thinks this scene is representative of working class Britain. Now, I'd say if that's what you think of when you think of working class people, or indeed white people, it might be you who's guilty of the prejudice here. And for a more positive and I think more accurate representation of what working class Britain is actually about, I'd recommend Alex Phillips considers Tony Hill. He was filmed this week rebuilding a wall at a mosque in Southport that was pushed down by the people Phillips is venerating.
What made you want to come out here today in this baking hot sun?
Well, the thing is, you see it on the news and it's just, it doesn't make any sense. You've got a vigil down the road and then you've got this going on.
Yeah.
These have done nothing wrong, so, you know, we spoke to the company we work for and they were coming down, so we just joined them. So, and then, yeah, just try and get it done before Tom makes a mess again. No one deserved it, did they?
Yeah, do you have a message for people who did tear this apart?
Oh, get your facts right first before you start doing stuff. No one else knows, do they? Facebook's a dangerous thing, isn't it? If you're not looking at it right, if you just want an agenda, make sure you get it right first, to be honest.
Well, I really, I mean, that video went absolutely viral because the guy is just so, you know, likable, inspirational. Aaron, I think, you know, these right-wing pundits who are sort of siding with the protesters and saying this is real Britain, I think they're taking a real risk here because I think lots of people, even right-wing people listening to them, will feel like, what, you know, do you think those people on the streets are what we're about? Because I am fairly confident, I haven't seen any polling on this, but I'm fairly confident that the vast majority of people of this country look at the people who've been out on the streets in Southport and Hartlepool and Downing Street this week and think, I want absolutely nothing to do with those people.
We have tools by which we can understand mass sentiment. And the most easily available one to anyone is, of course, Google search trends. Now, if you look at search trends from the last several days, almost all of it pertains to the Olympics. So you've got Wednesday, July the 31st, number one, Alex Yee. Number two, Fred Sirieix, of course. Congratulations, Fred. His daughter came third in the Olympics diving, synchronized diving. Ismail Hania, the Hugh Edwards story. People have interest in 101 things. Just as many people, more people, in fact, are thinking about the interest rate cut announced by the Bank of England yesterday, the first interest rate cut in 4 years. That will be really important news to lots of people because they'll think, okay, well, when I remortgage, it may mean that actually things won't be as bad as I thought. Or if you're trying to get a mortgage, you're thinking, wow, well, next month, the month after that, will be better than 2-3 months ago, or even right now. So this idea that this particular event, this particular scene captures, you know, the whole of the white working class is just pure and utter idiocy. And as you've said, Michael, we don't even need to think about polls and data or even Google Trends. We had a literal general election campaign very recently, which told us how politically active or politically involved people over the age of 18 feel and think about politics. Now, on the one hand, only 1 in 5 eligible voters voted for Labour. That's true. We had relatively low turnout, and Labour have the lowest number of votes for a majority, let alone a majority of more than 170. Absolutely true. However, Labour did come first. The Conservative Party did get, I think, mid-20s. Even if you put the Conservative Party and Reform together, they got significantly fewer votes than the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and Labour. If you're talking about these as voter blocks, significantly fewer. Much fewer. If we had PR, they would be nowhere near power. They wouldn't be able to get power if we had a purely proportional electoral system. So it's stupid. It's dumb. I think, you know, as well with regards to Isabel Oakeshott and Richard Tice, there was that photo that was shared by Isabel Oakeshott of a pretty standard back street, I think in Yorkshire, and she was saying, you know, how awful this is, and that's what terrace housing in that part of the world has looked like for a really long time. And yes, it should be better. We shouldn't have gaps in roads, and people should have a bit more money in their back pocket to be able to maybe look after their houses a bit better. We shouldn't have HMOs being built into 2 up, 2 downs because that often deteriorates the standard of the whole street, etc. Of course, all of those things are bad, and those are about how do we wish to build our economy and how much do we want to give working people in their back pocket. That's why, for instance, I support things like pay rise for public sector workers. So there is this real disconnect between people like Isabel Oakeshott and I think much of the public. And I would add one more variable to all of this, which you didn't mention, Michael. We sort of hinted at it already with Twitter, which has just clearly become this machine for. And I'm honestly not pulling my punches, but I'm also trying to be sensitive with the language I use here. this has clearly become a machine for compulsive, obsessive thinking, and I think very soft forms of mental illness for lots of people on the right. I honestly believe this because there's just this compulsive, vindictive anger constantly every day, and it can never be satiated since Elon Musk bought it. X/Twitter has always been prone to quite negative mental health consequence externalities, but I think it's just gone off a cliff now. And so people like Isabel Oakeshott, they look at their Twitter feed and they think that's where everybody is at, but it's not where everybody is at. If you're a teacher, if you're a junior doctor, if you're anybody really in the public sector, and I've spoken to a number of people about this, police officers, nurses who already had a pay rise. I've spoken to a number of people about this, teachers. They are expecting a better deal on pay over the next 5 years than the last 5 years. That's because it's a Labour government. Even people that don't normally vote Labour, I've spoken to a police officer, for instance, who doesn't normally vote Labour, voted Labour, have said this to me. They're expecting a better 5 years with regards to their pay than the last 5 years. So they're actually a little bit more optimistic. Okay, if people were so excited about the Tories and about the right, they would have gone and voted for them. And to underscore my point around Twitter or X, there are lots of accounts on the right, and I've quote tweeted some of them. If you want to look at my feed over the last few days, you can see some instances of this. And they're saying, I don't think Labour makes Christmas. How things have fallen off a cliff since Labour came into power. Well, firstly, the average vote, the average punter is going to give Labour time. Secondly, I wouldn't be that surprised if in the second half of this year, particularly in Q4, the final 3 months of the year, we actually see a bit of an economic boom because you've got these new public pay deals coming in into gear, particularly with junior doctors, but we'll see other ones too. Clearly, Rachel Reeves is going to give pay rises to public sector workers. That's already obvious from the first month of this government. They will generally meet the recommendations of pay boards. And we've also seen, like I said earlier, a cut in the base rate of interest. So the cost of accessing credit will fall. We're seeing house prices already ticking up, which if you don't own a house isn't great, but that generally indicates optimism and confidence in the broader economy with regards to consumer demand. So you had this bizarre moment where these people go, oh my God, the world's falling apart. And actually, I wouldn't be that surprised if by the last quarter of this year, Britain's economic situation is the best it's looked in a really long time, possibly since 2016. So I agree with everything you've said, and I'd throw Twitter into the mix, Michael. These people are psyoping themselves.
Yeah, so we didn't have a Friday feud today, and we've ended by agreeing with everything each other have said. Aaron, it's been a harmonious evening with you. Have a fantastic weekend.
My pleasure, Michael. I hope you have a wonderful weekend too.
And thank you guys all for watching. I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy the last of the sun. We'll be back on Monday from 6 p.m. Of course, for now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.